Welcome. My name is Barbara Myers, and I'm an ordained minister whose ministry focuses on mental health issues. Today on Mental Health Matters, we're going to talk about the problem of mental health stigma. We'll look at it through the eyes of people who have experienced it themselves or in their families. Before we start, I'd like to define what we mean by the term stigma. This word is normally used as a brand of shame or of disgrace or dishonor. In the case of mental health stigma, it's a brand of something bad or negative having to do with one's mental health. And in the case of mental health stigma, it can affect a person's feeling of self-worth, creativity, spirituality, energy, and so forth. And tragically, it often prevents people from seeking treatment, so that there's a lot of unnecessary suffering that happens. And because of this, it just damages society as a whole. Now, lest you think that people with mental health problems have nothing worthwhile to offer to society, I'd like to point out that each of the art images that you saw preceding this show and the music that you heard preceding the show were painted and composed by artists who had mental health issues. These extraordinarily talented people have offered much beauty to our society, and we should all wish to encourage this kind of creativity that they experienced. It's the goal of this program to address the problem of mental health stigma and thus enrich our lives now and in the future. My guests today are two people who have experienced this issue from different perspectives. First, I'd like to introduce Liz Riedensdorf, who's experienced mental health issues from the perspective of a family member and also perspective of a provider of mental health services. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Stephen Buchholz, who has experienced mental health issues both as a person with the issues and as a provider of services to people with the issues. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Before we tell our stories, I thought we'd start by defining some of the terms that we will be using during our program. You probably have noticed that there are different terms for defining mental health problems. For example, mental illness or mental disorder, mental health issue, mental health problem. Those sets of words have all been used from time to time. And another example is the use of the term referring to the person who has the mental health problem. You may have heard the word consumer or client or patient or even psychiatric survivor be used to refer to someone with a mental health problem. Often the use of the terms that we use can affect how we see those who are ill and their family members. Stephen, can you tell me what terms you prefer to use and why?
I tend to lean away from using mental illness as a term because the connotation is that I have some sort of disease that can't be cured. And for me, I use mental health issues because it has a sense of being more integrated into who I am. It's one aspect of who I am. In terms of what I call myself, I don't like the term consumer, although I know a lot of people use it because it sounds like I'm buying a refrigerator or something, and I don't look at mental health services that way. I prefer the term client because to me it indicates respect. You use the word client for lawyers and doctors. So those are the terms that I prefer.
Okay. And Liz, what terms do you prefer to use?
Well, I probably use the word client, and I use a wide variety of other terms I use the word mental illness because it's sort of a shorthand. Chemical imbalance, mental health issues. It sort of depends. I'm flexible.
Okay. Well, in this show today we'll be using the terms that we're comfortable using. I myself I think mental health issue is the thing that I use most often, although I hear when other terms are used. And I refer to myself as a consumer because I am a consumer of mental health stories as well as other things. So I refer to myself as a consumer. Okay, so now we'd like to hear some about your story of how you got to be here and how you have experienced mental health issues and in particular mental health stigma is what we'll be getting to later on. So first I'll let Stephen talk about his experiences.
Well, usually when people ask me to introduce myself in mental health settings, I do two introductions, and one of them is a mental illness introduction, and the other is a mental wellness introduction. So I can start out with the mental illness introduction. I'm diagnosed with bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. I've also been diagnosed with dissociative personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and I created my own diagnosis called compulsive self-disclosure disorder. And I take many medications. Right now I take 2 mood stabilizers, trileptal and what I call the Yiddish medication, Lamictal. And I also take 2 antidepressants, Luvox and Trazodone. I've been hospitalized 6 or 7 times, and I've made 8 suicide attempts. So that's my mental illness introduction. My mental wellness introduction, I'm a 51-year-old gay man. I have a bachelor's degree in speech pathology and a master's degree in education. For many years, I worked with mental health clients who were trying to get back to work. And just 6 weeks ago, I joined the Anglican Franciscans to work towards becoming a monk, which is very exciting for me. I like to read mystery novels, shopping, interior decoration, and included in my mental wellness introduction is that I have mental health issues that are actually, can be a positive in the way that I am and the way that I live my life.
Okay, thank you. And Liz, I'd like to hear from you some of your story.
That's a hard act to follow. I have a son and a daughter, but my son as a youngster, and it's very hard for me to talk about him as a young child. I don't think much about it because he was just a lovely little boy who looked under rocks to find what lurked beneath, and artistic, curious, sweet, and loving. And he still is, but there's a cloud right now. And when he was about 19, which is about 15 years ago, he came into the house. He had done okay in school and a little bit shaky in high school, but that sort of goes along with being an adolescent. And came out this time, he was probably about a junior in high school, maybe a senior, and he came in and started talking about himself in the third person and saying that this person should kill himself. And that was just sort of the beginning. A long saga of multiple hospitalizations, multiple contacts with the police. He made a couple of suicide attempts. He broke both his ankles from jumping off a freeway overpass. Was in a board and care for a short time. Was in the criminal justice system. We had to deal with bail bondsmen and that, which wasn't fun for his middle-class parents. But now he's somewhat stabilized on Clozaril. It's not, we need something else. And the amount of stress that came into the family, we're not living together as a family. He lives with his father, and he goes out 1 day a week to a day treatment, which is very positive. But the rest of the time, he has no friends. He's in the back bedroom smoking and talking to himself. And will not speak to either one of his parents unless there's something he wants, and doesn't watch television and doesn't do the computer. So that's where we are, and it's very painful. And I we worry excessively about what's going to happen when we're not around, because we care for this boy passionately, and he really can't handle things by himself.
Right. Wow. Wonderful stories, both of you, and heart-wrenching in both cases. I'll tell a little bit of my story because I'm a mental health consumer. I was hospitalized after my daughter was born for postpartum depression, and for a long time was very unhappy about the fact that I had a mental health problem, and internalized in many ways the stigma of society against myself, thinking that I was a defective human being of some sort and completely not worthwhile. And it was only after I got a lot of therapy and was very motivated to try to change the way I thought of myself that I was able to turn that around and see that I have a lot to offer the world, and just in the terms of knowing that they aren't worthless human beings, that they're all beautiful people with all wonderful talents and things that they can offer to the world. So, but I know that feeling of internalized stigma, and sometimes I've even thought that the stigma is almost worse than the disease because of the effect that it has on, the limiting effect it has on you and your whole self-confidence and your whole feeling of self-worth and so forth. And I'm very grateful that I've been able to get over that for the most part myself. So I was wondering if I might get some examples from each of you of how you might have experienced stigma and what it was that helped get you over it or helped get you through it.
An example, when we talked about what we might talk about today earlier, I remember very clearly being in a subacute care hospital in San Leandro, and there was a psych tech, a woman who was not very nice, and she would constantly talk down to me and very parental, and I was probably her same age. And one day I said, "You don't have to talk to me like I'm a child." And she said, "Well, then what are you doing here?" And I found that very, very hurtful.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not here because I act like a child. And I don't think that's very supportive. The other thing is, what I experience more is people who have no idea that they're stigmatizing. Just recently, a group of people that I know who I care about very much, they started talking about people that were crazy, and they were talking about this one woman, and they were saying that, she's a raving lunatic, and they described her behavior, and what I told them is that I have those same behaviors, so when you say those things, you're actually talking about me, and that really hurts me. But the terms, spinning their fingers around somebody and around their head and that kind of thing is very hurtful.
Right. And some of it I think you just pick up and you don't realize that you pick up.
And I think the internalized stigma is something that I can really identify with because, I had a career as a teacher and I found myself, I thought I was very creative, and then I was diagnosed, and a lot of the things that I thought about or talked about in terms of my prayer life or whatever was labeled delusional. And so I decided that I wouldn't do any of those things because of that label. And when I would talk about those things, I was afraid that people would see me as crazy. So it really, on some level, caused paralysis in terms of how I was living my life. It took me a long time to come out of it.
So maybe with your new vocation, you found a way to get back to some of those.
Well, I think I was able to reclaim. For years I thought, God was calling me to do something, and then it was labeled as delusional. And then with the help of a therapist who is also a religious, he was saying, no, that's not delusional. That within that, what people label as crazy is spirituality and creativity. There's also distortion that needs to be addressed. But what ends up happening lots of times is because of the stigma of the strangeness, all of it gets sort of stamped out, and it makes life very painful.
Right.
Stable, but painful.
Yeah. How about you, Liz? Do you have some examples?
Sure, I have more indirect. One is one that I'm not a confrontational person, but around Christmas time there was an email joke going around, taking carols and distorting the titles and then labeling them as which clinical group they belong to. And I probably have seen them, and I was looking at them and thinking, I need to stop this. And so I wrote out about 6 emails saying, this is very painful. You're making fun of people. And I said, I just visited my son. He's lying on his bed, no friends in the world, very sad, very gaunt. This is cruel. And so I really sort of threw some friendships up for grabs there. But I got good response back. People didn't know. Of course, now I'm not on their email list, but I felt I had to confront it.
Right.
And that was sort of a more active type. The other one I was recalling, I was at a little dinner party with some people I knew and some I didn't. We were going to go off to the theater afterwards. And we were talking about what we were doing in our life, and I was mentioning a lot of my volunteer work in the mental illness community. And and I mentioned about my son, and we all talked and went on to other things. And then afterwards, one woman came up to me and took me aside and said, "Don't tell anybody. I have a daughter also who has schizophrenia." And I was, and she's at home, and no one knows I have, this relative. And it was just so painful because by talking about it, you can realize everyone there probably had a relative or someone they knew who had an illness, but she was stigmatizing it in her own family.
Right.
And that was what was so painful. To watch her pain, and then, of course, the daughter's pain. The mother won't even acknowledge I'm around. So.
Wow. Well, I'll just give you an example from my own experience as a minister. Many times I go talk to congregations and give guest sermons, and usually I'm asked to talk about mental health because that's my specialty, and I'll talk about some factual information about mental health, and then I'll tell some of my own story. And when I'm finished, I ask people to stand in body or spirit, however they can, if they or someone that they love is living with a mental illness. And every time I've ever done this, and this is, many times, there's been somewhere between 80 and 100% of the people will stand up. And they all look around and can't believe how many other people stood up and how pervasive it is. And I always get a crowd of people coming afterwards just telling me about their issue, and I'm so glad you said this in church. We could never talk about this before. And all more that I did was create a safe space where it's okay to talk about it. And, I'm the person at least with some amount of authority because I'm a minister, saying that I too have a mental illness and live with it and in recovery continually. And I found that's the biggest thing that I have been able to discover that helps dispel stigma is, to stand there and say, me too, and then everybody else having enough courage to acknowledge that they too participate in that.
Right.
So, can you tell us how you've gotten support to deal with these kinds of issues?
Well, I can, we floundered for quite a while. Too raw to go anywhere, really, outside of a psychiatrist. And then, of course, we had the very common issue about medication and compliance, not wanting to take the medication because why sign yourself up as a young person to take medication the rest of your life? So even though I was a psychologist in my other life, I was very naive about this all. And so I look back at myself and go, but I called, I think it was Highland Psychiatric Board, and I had known, if you have an animal that's ailing, there are ways you can get medications in them. There's all sorts of tricks of the trade. And I truly thought there was some trick for a grown man. So I called the psychiatric ward and said, just a simple question. Simple answer, don't take up much of your time. what do you do to get medications down somebody? And the woman on the other end said, honey, you better join the support group. So I did, and I joined NAMI support group, and meeting other people who are at different stages or just coming into it or along, it was just a fact that I wasn't alone.
So NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is a national organization.
And there's chapters throughout the county, and it's just been a great support to know other people, and we support each other and we support our relatives. So.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And Stephen, how about you?
Well, initially, I think I came into the mental health system through a therapist, and then she kind of determined that I might need some medication, and I saw a psychiatrist and went through, a couple of psychiatrists. One of the things that I found, especially in one of my hospitalizations, it was probably the second or third hospitalization, was I found that I really got some assistance from talking to other clients. And we would sit around and talk about what had happened in our lives and why we were there, and I just found this incredible sense of support and not being alone. And it wasn't somebody reaching down to me, it was somebody reaching across to me, and there was real healing in that. And so then I actually found some support groups, Creative Living Center in Berkeley, where I could go and do art and talk to other people, and self-help groups, and eventually got connected and actually became a peer counselor, and that really changed my life in terms of I realized that having a mental health issue was actually on some level a gift, because I could be of help and assistance to other people who were experiencing
what I was
experiencing.
Yeah, that's always the trick, isn't it? To learn how to take something that's negative in your life and turn it around and make it work for you and for others. That's where I found the gift too.
And I think part of the, I have a little bit of alphabet after my name. I have a M-E-D after my name. And that gave me, I used to tell people, I kind of felt like a spy, because I could sit in rooms where people were talking about people with mental health clients, and they didn't know one was sitting in the room. And so I had an opportunity to combat some stigma by just speaking up and saying, I'm in the room, is something that you were talking about. And I think that's really important. I mean, it relates in terms of me being a gay man, that when I would say, I'm a gay man, it changed things.
Okay.
So.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, a person's understanding of mental health issues and recovery occur within the context of their own cultural background. Now, we're three white people here sitting here, and we've given, as such, our perspectives on our experiences from that environment. However, we need to acknowledge, I think, that there are other groups that already suffer from stigma, not even mental health stigma, but other stigma and discrimination because of what they are. Examples are people of color, seniors, people who are gay, lesbian, transgender individuals, and so forth. Now, mental health stigma would be another layer of stigma on top of what they already feel, and it can make it even more difficult for them to be treated well. Fortunately, there are some mental health support groups that specialize in particular racial or cultural areas that can be very helpful to others in the area. I'll now offer a challenge to those of you watching this broadcast. Think of what you can do to lessen the problem of mental health stigma. It might be a change in your own thinking, or in changing of how you view yourself or others, or maybe contacting a support group, or taking some other concrete steps or actions in the community. I'll leave you with that open assignment. If you would like to explore the problem of mental health stigma further, Alameda County has an anti-stigma speakers bureau which sends people out to different organizations to talk about mental health stigma. You can contact the Alameda County Behavioral Health Care Services for more information or to schedule a visit from this group. In summary, mental health stigma is harmful to individuals, to families, and to society as a whole. I hope that we have shown you that there is hope in addressing the lives of those affected. We do not have to suffer in silence. In fact, society as a whole will be better off when this problem is dealt with. If you or your family has a mental health problem and want to contact a group that will be able to help you, here are some phone numbers. In many cases, it may be possible to request a referral to a group or service that specializes in a particular ethnic or cultural group. Mental health services can be contacted at a 1-800 number, 1-800-491-9099. There are people that can refer you to family support groups at 510-835-5010. And there's a suicide hotline at 1-800-309-2131. I'd like to thank our guests, Liz and Steve,
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
for being with us. To close, I'll say, take courage, friends. The way is often hard. The path is never clear and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone. Thank you, and remember that mental health matters.